Um, Perfect. I'm going to be talking to you. The title of my presentation is Cultivating Global Civic Professionals Through International Internship Programs. A little about me before I start. My name is Bill. I'm an assistant teaching professor. I'm also the Associate Director of Experiential Learning at UC San Diego. And this presentation, eventually is going to go into a conversation, I'm hoping, about practices that you all maybe know about or have employed or created. But it is based off of my own experience designing and teaching international internship programs and some of what I see as the challenges and also opportunities to really make these impactful learning experiences for students. A little bit quick agenda for us here. I'm going to go over some introduction, some context to the topic I'll be speaking of today. I'm going to introduce a concept that maybe you're familiar with, but maybe not, civic professionalism, and what are some core objectives related to the facilitation of civic professionalism within students. I'll give you a little bit more information on why I think international internships are such an important um, learning opportunity for students and the potential that they hold. And then I'll move into the case study of my own program, pulling out some practices, some assignment examples that I've used that have been helpful in terms of getting students to the space of thinking like civic professionals. And then we'll conclude and hopefully have a little chat. All right, so the context for this is, and I should note here that most of my work here and that I'm presenting here is from the US context, although I will say generally, pretty much everything I'm going to be saying here is universally applied, and we're seeing similar trends generally across the globe. And so, as you may know, if you work with students, students are increasingly concerned about employment. 80% of students in the US at least are worried about finding a job after they graduate, right? And so this isn't necessarily something new, but it's actually something that is increasing over time. We are seeing, this kind of anxiety, this worry increase, and this was even before the advent of AI and Gen AI and all the fears and anxieties that have come along with that. Um, and international internships, probably not surprisingly, and I think definitely probably in correlation, are becoming increasingly popular, especially in the US. We've seen a rise of over 50% of students participating in international internships. And I should be specific here, credit-bearing international internships, the ones that they do through universities or educational providers. These have increased over 50%, as I mentioned, from pre-pandemic levels. And so not surprisingly, right, as students are more worried about employment, they're seeking out ways to become more competitive, which historically internships, and especially in a globalizing workforce, right, international internships are seen as one of those things they can do to really increase their profile, which isn't necessarily bad, right? International internships are great, but I think there's challenges related to them and opportunities that we need to really think through as educators and international ed leaders to think through intentional design of these programs. Because one of the potential problems that I do see happening in the field is that international internships are often focusing almost exclusively on this idea of job skill development or career readiness, right? Or these economic, what I like to call economic motives for doing this work, rather than, and sometimes completely overlooking the elements of the more humanistic motives. So things like critical awareness or inquiry that can also be developed through these programs. This stands out if you look at publications across the field. CIEE had their most recent, I think last year, came out. They had a big report on international internships with the title Standing Out in a Competitive Market. And so again, just kind of reinforcing this idea that the benefit of these programs lies primarily within the economic kind of skill development, career readiness that they can provide. This is also true if you look at the literature, I should say the marketing for most of these programs in terms of even intercultural communication, intercultural skills are often framed with the kind of lens of a skill, a career skill, right? This will help you get a job, for example, which again isn't bad necessarily, but it lacks, it's leaving potential on the table because the question I have is if we continue to talk about international internships within the context of you know, job preparation, how can you succeed in the economy? We risk reifying and continuing to solidify assumptions and also processes of a system that may not be the best, right? So, I mean, if we look at the economic system today, there's vast inequalities, there's vast corruption, and part of that, I believe, is that we're not necessarily teaching students intentionally how to transform these spaces or transform their workplaces. We're teaching them how to succeed within the reality that already exists. And I think we need to think about how we can do both, how we can prepare students to succeed in a system that might be unethical or unfair or unjust, while also simultaneously giving them the skills to transform it. And so with that, I think one North Star for me in doing this work has been the concept of civic professionalism. And I introduce it here to you because I think it provides a really helpful guiding framework for thinking about what actually are we trying to do when we're trying to teach students to both succeed in the workplace, but also to improve it. And so civic professionalism entails an integration of students' educational experiences with the orientation and resources necessary for the ethical application of knowledge as individuals, as workers, citizens, and participants in civil society. I'll give you another quote here. It means understanding the deeper purposes of social practices, enabling individuals to consider what knowledge is appropriate to a situation, how to best use that knowledge in practice, and perhaps most importantly, to judge when and why one is making the right decision. And so, in other words, right, in much more generalized terms, I think of civic professionalism as teaching students to think about the impacts of their work, of their professions, and of their decisions outside of just the immediate. And so, thinking through, well, this may be the policy of my work, but why is that? And what benefit or what consequences does that decision have, right? Or that practice have? To get them thinking a little bit more holistically about the civic implications of the work that they do. And in the work I've been doing, I've spent a lot of time thinking about, okay, how do I operationalize that? And in designing these courses, I found three critical areas, things that I call core objectives of programs, international internship programs I run, that I think are really fundamental to make sure are addressed if we're trying to get students to the place of thinking as change makers, thinking as not just workers, but of people who can make change and inform the future of their workforces and ultimately their communities. And so the first is getting students to think about positionality, where they come to this work from, and what assumptions they have that underline even why they want to do this work, but also the importance that they see of this work, or what even their values are in terms of their work or the workplace they want to be in. The second one is critical thinking and systems thinking. And I think especially now in the advent of AI, getting students to think really critically about the work they're doing and what are the implications of it, as I mentioned, beyond just say the monetary gain of the company or of just working with the client, but on broader society. So really thinking through these systems, right? And by systems, I mean, also thinking about, larger systems like capitalism, globalization, and the impact those have. But I also mean it in terms of the more activist way of thinking about systems thinking, which is how do systems interact with one another in a way that creates change? And then the third one is problem identification and problem solving. I think it's really it's really fundamental that we teach students not just to identify problems and identify critiques, but to think through how you can begin solving those. And so for that, that means to me, like moving students towards action, moving them from their minds to the real world and thinking through solutions to problems that they might have identified. I had a mentor one time tell me, and it's really stuck with me, that like a lot of people are good problem identifiers, but there's a lot fewer people who are problem solvers. And I think it's incumbent upon us to move students, especially given, all the issues we face in today's society, move them towards thinking about how to solve problems. And so I'm going to go through a few assignments of mine that I've crafted to hopefully kind of, uplift these three core objectives. But before I do that, I just want to take a moment to also emphasize why international internships, I think, are such an important place to get students to think critically and get them thinking in terms of change making. And the first one is, right, and this is probably already on everyone's mind in this space, but students are already outside of their own culture, right? And so they already have this outsider vantage point when they are doing an internship or doing anything, studying abroad outside their home country. And as you all know, this gives students a unique perspective to reflect on the assumptions and biases that they have. And so when they're already in a foreign space, I found that it opens them up to be more critical about things that they might otherwise take for granted. And so I think it's important for us to capitalize on that kind of outsider vantage point that they're experiencing while abroad. Allows students to see tangible illustrations of abstract concepts. And by this, I mean, in a lot of my classes I teach domestically, we talk about things like globalization, capitalism, or work culture. But it's hard to tangibly see unless you're in it and you're experiencing it. And the impact of being abroad in a different work culture gives them a direct comparison to begin to investigate these topics. Like, how does capitalism look different, say, in Ireland than it does in the US? And that can look, in, taking that broad question, that kind of abstract question, and it becomes more tangible when you think about, well, okay, well, why do people seem to have more rent control here? Or why does healthcare seem to be cheaper? Or whatever you may have, there's examples that they're living through and seeing that make these concepts a lot easier to digest and also analyze. Providing an opportunity to pair classroom learning with experiential learning. This is, kind of the core behind internships is you're getting an opportunity to talk about these kind of abstract topics and then asking students to go in and find them in their everyday lives and the work they're doing. And so the experiential part of it, right, is really core. And then just a note here, that international internships also attract students from very diverse backgrounds. And we see this a lot, and we can understand if you get into the literature why that might be. There are obstacles for a lot of students to studying abroad. But if you say, hey, we're going to pair this with a work opportunity, for example, it becomes one of those incentives maybe, goes away, which is students from economic communities might feel that they have to be working towards something that will financially benefit them, right? And so it opens up. And so with all these things, I think it gives us a very clear understanding that international internship programs are a really important opportunity to get students thinking critically. And I think it's, again, incumbent upon all of us as educators to think about how can we design and facilitate these programs in a way that really squeezes out all the potential that they do have to educate and grow and enhance student learning. So my case study, I run an international internship program in Six College Dublin. It's called Six College Internships in Dublin, Ireland, and it is open to students from all majors, so it's interdisciplinary. Students are placed using a provider in a field of their choice, and then they take 2 courses with me. They actually do these, to my dismay, I teach these remotely. I would love to be there on the ground, but 2 small kids at home has necessitated this setup that we have. And so they take 2 classes with me. And in those classes, and in particularly one of the classes that kind of encompasses the international experience, I really work with them to unpack what they're experiencing in a way that both helps them succeed in their current job, in their current internship, but hopefully gives them a little bit more perspective on their field as a whole. And so I'm just going to go through a few of these examples. As I mentioned, one of the core objectives is to get students thinking about the positionality and the assumptions they hold. So early in the quarter, we start off with what an activity I've designed called a career matrix, where I work students through thinking through like the 4 main tenets of what leads to job and career satisfaction and fulfillment. And if you look at the literature, it's skills, personality, values, and interests. And so we work through this really iterative workshop, and every student comes up with with a filled-in career matrix in terms of the things they value, what they want in a job, and then we share these out. And this experience is illuminating because it shares with students that other students might have different ideas about what's important or what they want in a job, and gives them a little bit of a reflection time on their own positionality and how they're coming into their professional identity or how they're viewing the workforce. Another assignment that I have them do is do a workplace observation. So they go in and, kind of in the spirit of ethnographic research, they go in and they observe their workplace for an entire week, taking notes. And then I ask them to write up an analysis. What values do you think this workplace has and why? What's telling you that? What are the activities and the interactions you're viewing and observing telling you about what this place values and what they are about? And often we'll have them connect that back to their own values that they have established. Does this meet your values, for example? But in doing that, they're getting, they're not just accepting the space as it is, but they're going in there as curious observers and asking questions like why. Another assignment we do is have students identify the impact of their organization in the place they're working. And so I use the Sustainable Development Goals as a framework and ask, how is your organization contributing to creating a better society? Or how is it not? And I have them look for examples that go deep right into terms of the human impact, supply chains, popular culture. What are all of the ways in which what your organization does is influencing society? And this is hard. And so this takes a lot of prompting, a kind of lot of going back and forth. But ultimately, they come up with a connection between what they do in this very localized sense and the impact it has on communities far, far outside of that local context. And within doing that, I think it really instills in them a sense of connection that they otherwise don't have, that they can be working in an accounting firm in Dublin, and that actually could have implications for countries and people across the world in ways that aren't so visible typically. And so, and you can also ask them to do optional things. I ask them, how does this align with your own values? Is this a place that you could get behind? I often have them create visual representations of this connection to really solidify the connection and how it's made. And so it again, going from their minds onto the paper is really helpful. And then asking them to identify the assumptions in their thinking. So if they're thinking, well, working at this nonprofit in Dublin actually impacts, people working in Europe or in the US, we have to unpack the assumptions behind those connections they're making. And again, getting them to do that self-reflexivity and thinking through their own biases. I know I'm running low on time, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. And then one of the other things I do, and this is in the spirit of getting them to think about action and problem solving, is we have them through their observations at the end of the quarter, at the end of the semester. I have them think about critiques that they have for their organization. What would you do differently? How could you make it more improved or efficient? And I have them write up a memo, a letter that they don't send to their supervisor, but that, that they could, right? That it would be such that it's professional enough, it's communicated enough, that they could articulate it. And this is an important piece of moving them to action, right? Getting them to think about, if they see something wrong, what can they do with that? How do they move to action? And getting practice in doing that and communicating that in an effective way. So those are a few things we do. I'm going to kind of speed through the assessment part, but I think when we're assessing for this kind of learning, it's important to realize that it's about engagement and not perfection. And so the homework assignments that I assign, all the ones I just mentioned, are graded pass, no pass. And they're always giving chances to resubmit. Because the idea here, right, is that they're going deep and they're trying to challenge their own assumptions and the depth of their learning, and that doesn't always happen on the first go round. And then the second way where we evaluate these is we have small group discussions where we unpack, where they're graded coming in, demonstrating that they've done the readings, but that they've also worked through and looked at these homework prompts, and that they've been prepared to have conversations. And so a big part of this unpacking is also students from different internships sharing their experiences, sharing their connections that they're drawing, allows all students to kind of understand a little bit more universally the impacts of work in all fields on the world and on society. So with that, I can feel Sylvie wanting to interrupt me. I'm sorry, I'm going too late. But the conclusion I want to draw, and this is where I'd love to open up conversation to, is international internships, I think, are really powerful learning opportunities. But without a critical approach, we risk reifying problematic and even dangerous systems and values. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to intentionally design courses and programs that really extract the full potential of these programs. And I think that starts with some of the things I mentioned, which is thinking about positionality, critical thinking, and problem identification and solving. And I will leave you with this final thought, which is that I think we must build programs that prepare students to succeed in the system as it is, while simultaneously providing them tools to transform it for the better. And so I would love to open up discussion in terms of ideas you all have or things you've been doing that might also be working in the same direction. Thank you.